Welcome to Unit 3 of the CLPNM's 2023 Annual Professional Learning Module. In this unit, we will share information about the reserved acts listed in the RHPA and how they will relate to your practice. The RHPA sets out a new way of regulating who does what in the provision of health services based on the concept of controlling specific healthcare services or procedures. These activities are described in the RHPA as reserved acts. They are reserved for designated healthcare professions when government is satisfied that members of those professions are competent. Reserved acts are restricted by Section 5 of the RHPA, which says that no person shall perform a reserved act in the course of providing health care unless the reserved act is authorized. While these activities are reserved for certain healthcare professions, reserved acts are not intended to be exclusive to a single profession. The reserved acts acknowledge that there is overlap in scopes of practice. This means that, as an LPN, you may find yourself working with members of different healthcare professions who are authorized to undertake many of the same reserved acts as each other and as you. The reserved acts will encourage interprofessional care and provide health system employers the opportunity to build the staff mix models that are best suited to the needs of their population. There are 21 categories of reserved acts. Profession-specific regulations under the RHPA will set out which of the 21 reserved acts each profession can perform, as well as limits and conditions on the performance of those acts. Take some time to review the list of reserved acts that will appear in the next few slides. You'll notice that some refer to specific interventions, while some capture fairly broad categories of activities. As you review the reserved acts, think about which of these activities are part of your practice as an LPN. Also note, as you go through the slides, that this is a complete list of all the activities defined as reserved acts in the RHPA. This is not a list of those that have been authorized for LPNs. The reserved acts that will ultimately be authorized for LPNs have not yet been confirmed. We will talk more about that later in this unit. If you find that this video recording moves forward too quickly for you, feel free to pause it as you review the reserved activities listed on each slide. Did you note any reserved acts that are part of your practice? If so, make a note of which ones. You may want to compare them to the list of reserved acts government intends to authorize for the profession once the list is announced. This will give you an opportunity to raise questions if you identify any misalignment between your practice and the draft list of reserved acts before the reserved acts become final. You are likely wondering at this point which reserved acts will be authorized for the profession of practical nursing. Unfortunately, at this stage, we cannot say for sure. The CLPNM has presented a proposal to government based on information we've gathered about current practice from LPNs, educators, and employers across the province. If you are one of the LPNs who responded to our requests for information about your practice over the past few years, thank you. The information you provided has been an important part of this process. It is now up to government to make the decisions, and at the time of publishing this learning module, the decisions have not yet been finalized. Government has advised regulatory colleges that its intent is to authorize the reserved acts that are being performed competently by LPNs today. When making decisions about authorizing reserved acts, the government will also consider whether the entry-level educational preparation of the profession provides foundational knowledge and whether adequate additional education is available to members of the profession if required. Government will also consider whether there are other available healthcare professionals who may be better suited to perform a reserved act, and whether there is a need in the system for multiple healthcare professions to be authorized. If your practice is unusual for an LPN and you are wondering if the reserved acts that you perform have been considered in the CLPNM proposal, please contact the CLPNM Practice Department. Our contact information is included at the end of Module 4. We expect that, in the coming year, draft regulations will be finalized and there will be a public consultation period during which LPNs and any other stakeholders can review and comment on the reserved acts government is considering before the regulations come into effect. The list of reserved acts includes only some of the healthcare services or procedures that are performed by health professionals within Manitoba's healthcare system. Specifically, it is a list of the activities that government has decided should be regulated more directly and explicitly in legislation. However, the CLPNM recognizes that the reserved acts do not represent all that you do and all the care that you provide. For example, health assessments are not reserved acts, nor are evaluations of care provided. Health teaching is not a reserved act, nor is communicating information about care to clients, their family, and their representatives. These activities are important components of the nursing care that you deliver and that we will not change under the RHPA. Even though we do not know yet which reserved acts will be authorized for the practical nurses, we know there will be general limitations on an LPN's authority to perform reserved acts, even those that are authorized for the profession overall. The general limitations that will apply to the performance of any reserved act are outlined here. The LPN must be legally authorized. This means more than the fact that the reserved act must be authorized for the profession. For example, a LPN with a specific condition on their certificate of practice indicating they cannot initiate IVs is not legally authorized to perform that reserved act, even if it is authorized for the profession overall. The LPN must also be competent. The LPN must have assessed that the reserved act is safe and appropriate in the circumstances. and the LPN must generally practice within their professional obligations as with anything they do. In Unit 2, we discussed Section 86 of the RHPA, which says an LPN must comply with the Act and regulations, but also the standards of practice and conduct, code of ethics, and practice directions for their profession. All those expectations apply when a practical nurse is performing a reserved act as well. It is the LPN's responsibility to ensure they are performing reserved acts within all of these general limitations. In addition, the LPN must also follow employer policies. For example, if a reserved act is authorized for the profession overall, if it is not authorized for LPNs working in a particular practice setting by their employer's policy, then the LPN should not perform the reserved act. If the LPN feels that the policy limitation is interfering with the LPN's ability to meet client needs, the LPN should collaborate with the employer to address the issue. In addition to the general limitations on reserved acts discussed on the previous slides, there are other limitations that may apply to specific reserved acts authorized for the LPN profession. Examples of the more specific limitations that may apply to individual reserved acts are noted here. The LPN might require an order, defined as an instruction or authorization for a specific client that is given to perform a reserved act. An order might be given by a physician, a nurse practitioner, a registered nurse, or registered psychiatric nurse who has an authorized prescriber designation, or by a member of another health profession that has been granted authority to issue orders. An example of a reserved act that would generally require an order is the administration of a prescription medication. The LPN might be required to work in collaboration with other healthcare professionals when performing the reserved act. Collaboration might be required when a clinical condition requires the intervention of a team or requires the application of knowledge, judgment, and skill that is not fully within the LPN scope of practice. In these cases, LPNs remain accountable for their actions within the context of the team. The LPN might be required to follow a clinical decision tool that has been adopted within their practice setting when performing a reserved act. A clinical decision tool is a document whose purpose is to guide, based on evidence, the assessment, diagnosis, or treatment of a client's specific clinical problem. The LPN might also be required to complete additional education before performing a reserved act. Examples of reserved acts that would require additional education include those that are taught in advanced cardiac life support or neonatal resuscitation. In some cases, the practice settings where a reserved act may be performed might also be limited in the regulations. LPNs should be aware that certain classes of people, activities, or circumstances have special exemptions in the RHPA. Performing certain reserved acts is not a breach of the RHPA if the reserved act is performed under one of the exempted circumstances. Pause here for a moment to review a few examples of these circumstances. As an LPN, it is important for you to be aware that there are exemptions mainly because you may work with unregulated care providers, such as students of other professions, healthcare aides, and clients' family members. Unlike regulated care professionals, these groups of persons do not have reserved acts authorized for them in regulations. However, they might still be authorized to perform some of the reserved acts if the reserved act is performed in an exempted circumstance. Take as an example a healthcare aide who assists a client to insert a hearing aid or assists another client in self-administration of medication. The healthcare aide would not be contravening the RHPA because they are performing reserved acts while assisting a person with their routine activities of living. You may be wondering if any of the exemptions will apply in your own practice as an LPN. At this point, it is too early for the CLPNM to be able to provide you with a definitive response to this question. We anticipate that all of the activities you would be expected to perform in your practice will be authorized in the regulations for your profession. This would make the need to rely on the exemptions moot. We cannot confirm this, however, until the regulations for your profession are finalized. Knowing that there are exemptions, you will be in a better position to understand any additional practice guidance the CLPNM might issue on this topic in future. Now that we've discussed the reserved acts, let's move on to a few scenarios that illustrate some of the decisions you might face in future once the reserved acts apply to your profession. Harpreet is an LPN working in a small rural community. She works in a physician's office and helps the practice meet the needs of its client base by assisting with health teaching, immunizations, and preventative screening. This scenario takes place in the future. The LPN profession has already transitioned to the RHPA. This means that the reserved acts authorized for the profession are known. Harpreet recalls seeing that one of the reserved acts authorized for the profession is Reserved Act 4, Procedures Beyond the Labia Majora. She recalls specifically seeing that collecting samples for cervical cancer screening is one of the specific examples of the purposes for which LPNs are authorized to perform this Reserved Act. In addition to confirming that the Reserved Act is authorized for her profession, what else does Harpreet need to consider to ensure that the Reserved Act is authorized in this circumstance? You might wish to pause the video and spend a minute reflecting on this question before moving to the next slide. After confirming that collecting samples for cervical cancer screening is a reserved act authorized for her profession, Harpreet also needs to consider whether she, as an individual professional, is authorized. That includes considering whether she has the additional education that is required to perform this activity, whether she is competent to perform the activity safely and effectively, and whether her employer has assigned this role to her within the team. Harpreet must also consider whether the Reserved Act is safe and appropriate in the circumstances. This would include confirming she has the client's informed consent, confirming that the practice environment is suitable, and confirming that she has the access to appropriate equipment and policies. By remembering that a Reserved Act is authorized for her profession, isn't necessarily authorized for all members of her profession and in all circumstances, Harpreet is in a better position to meet her professional standards and her obligations under the RHPA. Adam, LPN, is new to working in a long-term care setting and is trying to understand whether he is authorized to perform a pressure ulcer risk assessment on a client using the Braden Risk Assessment Tool and Braden Scale. Adam reviewed the list of reserved acts for LPNs and does not see skin and/or pressure ulcer assessments listed. Adam is concerned that he is not authorized to perform this assessment. Can Adam perform a pressure ulcer risk assessment using the Braden scale if it is not listed as a reserved act authorized for LPNs? Yes, integumentary assessments, including pressure ulcer risk assessments, are in the scope of practice for LPNs. In fact, Assessment is an expected part of the nursing process. Assessment is not one of the 21 reserved acts, so Adam will not find reference to it there. The reserved acts do not encompass the full scope of the profession. Nursing assessments are part of LPN practice and within Adam's professional scope. Pierre, LPN, who works in an acute medical unit, applies for and is awarded a position in the emergency department at the same facility where he has worked for the past 12 years. Although he is one of the more senior nurses on the medical unit, nursing in an emergency department will be new for him. The emergency department program team manager informs Pierre there are reserved acts performed in the emergency department that are only authorized for LPNs who have completed additional education. Pierre will need to complete the additional education, but is asked to start his new position as soon as possible. He is informed he can work while he waits to complete the additional education. On his first day, the program team manager introduces Pierre to the staff and briefs the staff that Pierre has not yet completed the emergency department additional education and will be assigned to the minor treatment and reassessment areas only for the time being. Can Pierre start his new position in the emergency department without completing all the additional education first? What should Pierre do if there is a reserved act required that he is not yet competent to perform? Yes, Pierre can start the position. He just can't perform the specific reserved acts that require additional education before he has completed the required education. In fact, like all LPNs, he should not perform any nursing activity, reserved act or otherwise, that he is not competent to perform. In this scenario, Pierre has communicated and collaborated with his employer to ensure that his current competence can be accommodated while he waits to complete the emergency department education. Pierre and his employer have problem solved by having Pierre work in the minor treatment and reassessment areas where the reserved acts that will be required are already within Pierre's individual competence. Colin, LPN, and his colleague Jane, RN, work on a unit where clients often have peripherally inserted central catheters or PICC lines. At times, client PICC lines become dislodged, blocked, or unusable and need to be replaced. In conversation, Colin and Jane's manager, Mary Grace, mentions that the facility is thinking about offering training to some of the nurses on the unit. The goal is to have more staff members at the facility able to replace PICC lines. Colin and Jane both wonder if PICC placement is a reserved act that is authorized for RNs or LPNs under the RHPA. They also wonder if it's possible for both professions to be authorized at the same time. Where could Colin and Jane look for information related to the RHPA and the reserved acts that are authorized for LPNs and RNs, respectively? Both Colin and Jane look for information on their respective regulatory body websites. Colin consults the CLPNM website and Jane checks the CRNM website. If this scenario were to take place in the future, after reserved acts have been confirmed for the LPN profession, Colin and Jane might find that their professions both have the authority to perform Reserved Act 3A, procedures below the dermis for the purposes of peripherally inserted central catheter placement after completing additional education. Colin and Jane will be able to clarify that reserved acts are reserved for authorized and competent professions, but more than one profession may be simultaneously authorized. Today, this scenario is hypothetical, as we cannot yet confirm which reserved acts government will ultimately authorize for the LPN profession. We believe there will be overlap between the reserved acts authorized for the RN and the LPN professions in Manitoba. In this unit of the 2023 Annual Professional Learning module, we discussed that reserved acts are regulated healthcare activities. They are reserved for healthcare professions whose members are competent. Government has designated 21 healthcare activities as reserved acts because they carry risk to clients. When a reserved act is authorized for a profession overall, it means that an individual member of the profession might be authorized, but the individual professional must still practice within any limitations and conditions that are in place to ensure safe and competent care. Next, move on to Unit 4, which is the last unit in the learning module. In Unit 4, we will provide an overview of the CLPNM's new Continuing Competency Program, which has been introduced as part of the profession's transition to the RHPA.